you find yourself standing on the dusty banks of the Nile, the river that has been flowing for thousands of years, long before you, long before anyone could even dream of cities, pyramids, or the strange art of wrapping dead bodies in linen. The sun hangs low, casting a golden glow over palm trees and mud brick houses. You can almost hear the faint whisper of history in the breeze, like a secret waiting to be told. Who would have thought that this ordinary-looking river would cradle one of humanity's most fascinating rituals, mummification? It's a process wrapped in mystery, religion, and a little bit of ancient science. Imagine people from thousands of years ago without your modern technology or preservatives figuring out how to stop decay, to pause death itself. You probably won't survive the thought of being dried out and embalmed, but here we are, standing at the start of that journey. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your location and local time in the comments. I'm curious where you are as we wander through this ancient story. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Back then, ancient Egypt was not just a place on a map, but a world pulsing with life and belief. The Nile was everything, a giver of life, a path for gods and spirits, and a keeper of secrets. Your feet sink slightly into the sandy earth as you imagine the first farmers settling here, watching the river flood each year, turning dry land into fertile fields. The natural cycle of life and death was clear. Crops grew, animals lived and died, and people knew they were part of something vast. But the Egyptians were special. They believed that life did not end with death, but continued in another realm. The dead needed their bodies preserved to house the soul on its journey. You might think of death as final, but to them, it was a doorway. So, they started developing ways to keep bodies from rotting, to prepare them for the afterlife. The earliest Egyptians didn't have a manual for this, just trial, error, and faith. They noticed how desert heat could dry out a dead body, naturally slowing decay. Slowly, they combined this with rituals and prayers. You can imagine them watching a dead fish or bird drying in the sun, wondering if the same could be done for humans. This marked the beginning of what would become the art and science of mummification. Historians still argue whether these methods began purely for practical reasons or if religious ideas were the real driving force from the start. But you can be sure the Nile was central, not only for life, but for this sacred process of preserving life beyond death. As the sun sets, casting long shadows over the desert, you realize you're not just stepping through a story, you're touching the beginnings of a belief system that shaped an entire civilization. And this is just the start. You follow the faint trail left by those earliest Egyptians as they begin to piece together the art of mummification. It's a slow dance between instinct and emerging ritual, where the desert's harshness meets a deep yearning to outwit death. At first, it's almost accidental. Dry heat naturally desiccates bodies, slowing decay, like when you leave fruit too long in the sun, and it turns into a shriveled raisin. But humans, you quickly realize, don't want to be raisins. They want their souls preserved, their stories carried forward. Picture the first experimental embalmers, probably farmers or village healers who noticed the natural mummification happening in desert sand pits or shallow graves. They might have thought, hey, that's neat. Maybe burying someone here in dry sand keeps them from rotting. And so the practice began to evolve. It's like early science mixed with magic, the beginning of a long ritualized process that later Egyptians would perfect. You'd expect embalming to be a quick thing: dump some salt, wrap some cloth, done. But no, it's a layered mystery wrapped in linen. One of the earliest tricks was using natron, a natural salt mixture harvested from dry lake beds. This stuff is like the OG desiccant, absorbing moisture, neutralizing bacteria, and basically giving a corpse a long-lasting makeover. The Egyptians got very good at this, leaving bodies salted for weeks, and then carefully wrapping them to keep everything in place. But why all the fuss? Because the body was not just a shell, it was the eternal home for the soul's parts. Egyptians believed the soul was complex. There was the K, the life force, the Bay, something like personality, and the Ache, the immortal spirit that could travel between worlds. If the body decayed, the soul might be homeless, lost to oblivion. So preserving flesh and bone was a spiritual emergency. Here's a quirky tidbit: the brain, surprisingly, was considered mostly useless by ancient Egyptians. Unlike today, where we worship the brain as the seat of intelligence, Egyptians thought the heart was where a person's true self lived. They actually pulled the brain out through the nose during embalming, tossing it aside like a bad script no one wanted. Some mummies have no brain at all, just empty cavities carefully packed with resin or linens. Historians still argue whether this removal of the brain was purely ritualistic or if it had practical embalming reasons too. Maybe the brain decomposed too quickly, or maybe it was an ancient form of selective preservation, kind of like keeping only what's important to your legacy. You also find yourself thinking about how this whole process must have been a big family affair at first. Embalmers were specialists, but communities were likely involved in rituals, songs, and prayers, ensuring that dead would be ready for the next chapter. It was part spiritual, part medical, and completely fascinating. So as you imagine these first steps: salt drying, careful wrapping, prayers whispered over a slowly transformed body, you feel the early pulse of an ancient science born from desperation, faith, and that stubborn human hope to live forever. You now find yourself standing in the shadow of the grand pyramids, where the line between life and death blurs into something almost divine. Pharaohs, those powerful rulers of Egypt, weren't content with just dying like ordinary folks. No, they wanted to transform death into eternal kingship, a rule that stretched beyond the sun's daily journey across the sky. To be a pharaoh was to be a god, both in life and in the afterlife. And this belief changed everything about how the dead were treated. Imagine you're a royal advisor watching a young prince ascend the throne. The preparations begin long before his last breath. Tombs are carved deep into the earth or built as towering pyramids, designed to protect his body and treasures. Pharaohs believed that to maintain order in the cosmos, their souls had to live forever, ruling over Egypt from the afterworld. Their eternal life depended on the perfection of their preserved bodies and the rituals surrounding them. You probably wouldn't envy the pharaoh's embalmer who had to meet incredibly high standards. The slightest mistake could mean the king's soul wandering, lost forever, a fate worse than death. These royal mummies weren't just wrapped bodies, they were symbols of divine power. Sometimes, the elaborate burial rituals took months or even years, turning death into a carefully staged drama of eternal life. You might be amused to know that some pharaohs, in their quest for immortality, insisted on including miniature models of servants and animals in their tombs, basically the ancient version of room service for the afterlife. Statues of favorite dogs, boats, and even entertainers were placed alongside treasures, all to ensure comfort beyond death. And if you think that's over the top, remember some tombs even had food preserved to last centuries. Imagine smelling ancient bread that's supposed to feed a dead king. Forever talk about a diet you can't mess up. Historians still argue whether these grand tombs were built primarily for spiritual reasons or as political tools to showcase power and intimidate rivals. The sheer scale of these monuments, like the Great Pyramid of Giza, still standing after 4,500 years, suggests a mix of both. And speaking of the Great Pyramid, you might recall the incredible precision with which it was built, aligning with the stars, the cardinal points, even the Nile. It's a marvel of engineering and religious symbolism, a tomb that itself is a kind of eternal monument to kingship. But beyond the royal elite, you can imagine how this culture of eternal kingship influenced ordinary Egyptians who might dream of their own afterlife, inspired by their pharaoh's promise to live forever. The king's tombs set a template for a society obsessed with death, preservation, and the hope for immortality. As you gaze up at the pyramids in the fading light, you realize this wasn't just about preserving bodies, it was about preserving a worldview where death was not the end, but a transformation, a continuation of power, life, and divine order. You step closer now, moving behind the scenes into the shadowy workshop where the embalmers, those mysterious craftsmen of death, perform their secret rites. This is no ordinary job. It's a delicate blend of science, religion, and artistry, requiring nerves of steel and hands that never tremble. You can almost hear the faint scraping of bronze tools and the faint scent of resin and spices mingling in the air, a smell that's oddly antiseptic even thousands of years later. First comes the brain, that squishy mass we talked about earlier. It's carefully extracted through the nostrils with a hooked tool, like an ancient version of a metal coat hanger. Not exactly your favorite medical procedure, but hey, this was ancient Egypt, not a modern hospital. The removal might sound brutal, but it was an essential step. Brains decompose quickly and could ruin the whole preservation effort if left inside. The embalmers had mastered this delicate surgery without anesthesia, relying on steady hands and ritual chants. After that, you watch as the embalmers make an incision on the left side of the body, carefully removing the internal organs: stomach, intestines, lungs, and liver. Each organ was treated separately, wrapped in linen, and either placed back inside the body after being preserved in jars, known as canopic jars, or buried alongside the mummy. These jars were often beautifully decorated, with lids shaped like the heads of protective deities, adding a layer of spiritual defense. Here's a fun, if slightly odd detail. One of the jars was guarded by the god Duamutef, who had a jackal head. You can almost imagine the embalmers whispering, "Don't let Duamutef catch you sneaking an extra snack," as they sealed the organs inside. This mix of divine protection and practical embalming reveals how intertwined religion and medicine were. The body was then dehydrated with natron salt for up to 40 days, essentially turning it into a dried husk. After that, the embalmers coated it with resin and wrapped it in countless layers of linen, each layer soaked with resins and oils to glue the wrappings and provide additional protection. This wasn't just a bandage job, it was a ritual, a slow transformation turning flesh into a preserved vessel. Historians still argue whether embalming was originally purely religious rite or a practical attempt to halt decay that gradually gained spiritual significance. Some think embalmers may have been seen as intermediaries between the living and the dead, almost like priests wielding the power to cheat death itself. You can't help but be fascinated by the tools, hooks, knives, and wooden splints that look like a blend of a surgeon's kit and a magical toolkit. The embalmer's workshop was a place where science, faith, and art merged, an ancient version of a high-tech lab dedicated to immortality. You pause to imagine the embalmers at work, chanting prayers over the body, carefully wrapping the linens, knowing that the success of their work meant the difference between eternal life and oblivion. It's a solemn craft, both sacred and practical, a final service to those crossing the threshold into the afterlife. You find yourself stepping beyond the physical preparations, diving into the realm where magic weaves through every linen fold and every bead of resin, where amulets and spells become the unseen guardians of the mummy's journey. It's as if the Egyptians understood that preservation of the body wasn't enough. The soul needed protection from all manner of cosmic hazards on its voyage through the afterlife. Imagine the mummy wrapped in dozens of amulets, tiny charms made from gold, faience, and semi-precious stones, each shaped like sacred animals, gods, or symbols. These were more than decorative jewelry. They were magical tools, each assigned a specific protective power. You might recognize the Eye of Horus, meant to guard against evil, or the scarab beetle, a symbol of rebirth and regeneration. Wrapped tightly into the linen, these charms formed a kind of spiritual armor. You probably didn't expect that ancient Egyptians were meticulous about every little detail, even down to the positioning of amulets. Some were placed over the heart to protect the soul's emotional center, while others guarded the throat or eyes. It's like the mummy was wearing a magical battle suit, ready to face whatever monsters or demons lurked in the shadowy corridors of the afterlife. Then there are the spells, more than 1,000 of them collected in the famous Book of the Dead. These spells were written on papyrus scrolls and tucked inside the coffin, or even painted directly onto the mummy's wrappings. Their purpose? To guide the soul safely past dangers, grant eternal life, and ensure the deceased's name was remembered forever. You can almost hear the whispers of priests reciting these spells during the embalming rituals, their voices rising and falling like a lullaby that lulls death into obedience. A quirky little fact, some spells even included instructions on how to deal with the ancient equivalent of traffic jams in the afterlife, navigating the complex bureaucracy of gods and demons who might question or delay the soul's progress. Imagine an afterlife where you need a spiritual GPS and plenty of patience. Historians still argue whether these spells were originally part of funerary rituals or borrowed from older traditions, evolving over centuries to become an indispensable part of Egyptian death culture. Either way, the power of words and symbols was absolutely central. So, as you imagine the mummy's journey, protected by magical charms and guided by sacred words, you see a civilization that didn't just fight physical decay, they fought the chaos of death itself with every tool at their disposal. This was no mere preservation, it was a cosmic battle, an epic story woven into linen and resin ready to unfold as the soul stepped into eternity. You slip through the heavy stone doors of a tomb, where silence reigns and shadows cling to walls adorned with vivid paintings of gods, pharaohs, and everyday life. This is the final resting place, not just a grave, but a carefully crafted world designed to shelter the dead forever. Tombs were not mere holes in the ground, they were miniature universes full of treasures, symbols, and secrets meant to accompany the soul on its endless journey. As you move deeper inside, the air grows cooler and your footsteps echo against smooth limestone. The walls are alive with scenes of feasts, gods weighing hearts against feathers, and servants tending to the needs of the deceased. These images weren't just decoration, they were believed to magically come to life, providing food, company, and protection. Imagine a banquet that never ends, forever frozen in paint. Tombs varied dramatically in size and splendor, from the modest mud brick chambers of commoners to the enormous, labyrinthine pyramids and rock-cut tombs of pharaohs and nobles. The elite packed their tombs with everything imaginable: gold jewelry, furniture, weapons, even board games. It's like packing for a really long trip, but instead of a suitcase, you're filling an entire underground palace. And there were traps, too, not just physical but symbolic ones. The idea was to deter grave robbers, those pesky treasure hunters who would risk curses and death to loot the riches inside. Some tombs had cleverly concealed false chambers or deadly pits, while others were protected by inscriptions warning of divine retribution. You might chuckle at these "do not disturb" signs, ancient Egyptian style, but they were deadly serious. Those curses about "he who disturbs this tomb shall perish" had teeth behind them, or at least that's what legend says. You may be surprised to learn that tomb raiding was rampant, even in ancient times. Despite all the traps and spells, many tombs were looted, leaving archaeologists today piecing together stories from what little was left behind. Historians still argue how much of the original treasures survived and what the rampant robbing tells us about ancient Egyptian society. Was it desperation, greed, or something else? The treasures themselves offer a glimpse into the deceased's life and status, but also their hopes and fears. The variety of objects, cosmetics, food, amulets, and even models of servants reflect a belief in an afterlife as vivid and complex as the life left behind. It's a stunning reminder that, for ancient Egyptians, death was not the end of experience, but a continuation, with comforts and protections carefully laid out like a roadmap. As you stand in the flickering torchlight of this tomb, you realize it is more than a resting place. It's a testament to a civilization obsessed with memory and immortality, a physical promise that even in death, life rich, complicated, and full of meaning endures. You step out from the tomb's shadow into the bright desert. Sunlight, the heat wrapping around you like a thick blanket. But your mind stays deep inside the quiet world of mummies, where even death has rules and quirks. One of the most curious is the role animals played in the journey beyond life. Egyptians didn't just mummify humans, they embalmed animals too. Cats, ibises, crocodiles, and even bulls were wrapped in linen and laid to rest with just as much care, sometimes in whole cemeteries dedicated to sacred animals. You might raise an eyebrow here. Why would they go to such lengths for animals? It turns out animals were seen as manifestations or companions of gods, and their mummification was a way to honor these divine connections. For example, the cat was sacred to Bastet, the goddess of home and fertility, and mummified cats were believed to carry prayers to her. Similarly, ibis birds were connected to Thoth, the god of wisdom. Imagine a bustling animal necropolis where thousands of tiny cat mummies are stacked like ancient souvenirs, or giant crocodile mummies that might seem terrifying, but were revered as the earthly forms of Sobek, god of the Nile and fertility. This obsession with animal preservation adds a whole other dimension to the Egyptian afterlife, one where divine creatures and humans shared the same eternal hopes. A quirky fact: sometimes these animal mummies were more symbolic than real. Some contained only bones, or even just stuffing inside them. Wrappings. Historians still debate whether these were mass-produced offerings for pilgrims or sacred ritual pieces with genuine spiritual value. It's like the ancient Egyptian version of souvenirs from a theme park. You can imagine how this reverence for animals seeped into daily life and death, blending practical and spiritual concerns. Mummified pets, for instance, were buried with owners or placed in their tombs, believed to accompany and protect them. This human-animal bond didn't end with death. It's fascinating to realize that the care lavished on animal mummies reflects a worldview where all life, divine or mortal, was interconnected. The afterlife wasn't a lonely journey, but a shared adventure, with gods, humans, and sacred beasts walking side by side through eternity. So next time you pet your cat or watch a bird flutter by, remember that in ancient Egypt, these creatures might already be on their way to a well-wrapped afterlife of their own, complete with spells and amulets, traveling eternally alongside their human companions. You follow the dusty path that leads from the golden age of mummification to a time of upheaval and change, where foreign invaders and shifting beliefs begin to rattle the ancient Egyptian world. The once unshakable traditions surrounding death and the afterlife start to encounter new ideas, foreign gods, and practical challenges. The old ways don't disappear. Overnight they evolve, adapt, and sometimes clash with the unstoppable march of history. As you watch, the power of the pharaohs wanes and new rulers appear: Persians, Greeks, Romans. Each brings their own customs, beliefs, and attitudes about death, creating a fascinating fusion of cultures. The art of mummification continues, but you notice changes in quality and style. Some mummies seem rushed, their wrappings looser, their rituals abbreviated. It's as if the ancient embalming workshop is struggling to keep up with time and changing tastes. One of the strangest shifts is the growing popularity of mummy portraits during the Roman period, lifelike paintings placed over them, faces of mummies, giving the dead a vivid, almost photographic identity. It's an oddly modern touch, considering how long Egyptian art had stuck to symbolic and idealized imagery. These portraits show you that even in death, identity mattered deeply, but now it's personal and expressive, not just divine. A quirky tidbit: some mummies from this period were even adorned with gold leaf masks that look a bit like Halloween costumes, a far cry from the solemn faces of earlier times. You can almost imagine the embalmers having a laugh or two while adding these flashy touches, blending ancient beliefs with new trends. Historians still argue whether the decline of traditional mummification was due to economic pressures, religious competition, or the simple reality that societies change. What's clear is that these later mummies tell a story of resilience and adaptation, a civilization holding on to its beliefs even as the world around it transformed drastically. As you reflect on these changes, you realize that mummification is more than a method, it's a mirror of Egypt's soul, reflecting its triumphs, fears, and adjustments through centuries. Even as the sands shift and empires rise and fall, the desire to preserve and remember, to conquer death itself, remains an unbroken thread. You now wander through the quiet halls of a museum where ancient mummies rest behind glass cases, their linen-wrapped bodies silent, witnesses to millennia gone by. Here, modern science meets ancient tradition, and the story of mummification takes on new layers through X-rays, CT scans, and DNA analyses. Suddenly, those carefully wrapped figures become more than relics, they become people again, with diseases, injuries, and personal stories etched into their bones and tissues. You probably didn't expect that technology would allow us to peer inside a mummy without disturbing its sacred wrappings. Imagine seeing their outlines of wooden splints holding broken bones in place, or detecting ancient dental work that rivals some modern dentists in complexity. These discoveries bring the past startlingly close, reminding us that these were real humans with flaws, pains, and lives, not just symbols. A quirky fact, some mummies even show signs of ancient plastic surgery, like nose reconstructions or attempts to fix injuries. Historians still argue about whether these were purely cosmetic or had rituals significance, but it's fascinating evidence of how advanced and caring Egyptian medical practices could be. You also learn that studying mummies helps solve puzzles about ancient diets, health, and social status. For instance, some high-ranking individuals suffered from arthritis or infections, while others show signs of heavy labor or malnutrition. These clues give a much richer picture of life in ancient Egypt, far beyond the tombs and pyramids. Modern forensic techniques have even sparked debates about it. The identity of famous mummies, was that really King Tutankhamun or someone else? These controversies keep historians busy and remind us that history is a living conversation, not a closed book. As you stand there, you feel a strange connection bridging thousands of years. Through science, the silent dead speak again, telling stories of survival, ambition, and mortality. The art of mummification becomes not just a method of preservation, but a gateway to understanding humanity itself. And so, the ancient embalmed dead continue to teach us not only about their world, but about our own, reflecting the timeless human desire to be remembered, understood, and perhaps to live forever. You drift back in time, imagining the bustling streets and marketplaces of ancient Egypt, where everyday people live their lives far from the grand tombs of kings, but deeply influenced by the culture of death. While pharaohs and nobles enjoyed elaborate mummification, the average Egyptian had simpler rituals, and yet their beliefs were just as profound. You walk alongside families preparing for funerals, where the cost of embalming and tomb construction meant many couldn't afford the full royal treatment. Instead, they relied on community ceremonies, prayers, and modest burials in shared cemeteries. The belief in an afterlife remained universal, but the expressions of that belief varied widely, reflecting social status and resources. Surprisingly, some commoners managed to get partial mummification or artificial mummification, involving shorter embalming periods or fewer wrappings. You can almost hear the bargain struck with embalmers who might speed up the process or simplify rituals for less money. These versions might not have been perfect, but they were believed sufficient to secure a place in the afterlife. A quirky insight here: some Egyptians used natron-packed shrouds to achieve dehydration without removing organs, creating a kind of halfway mummy. Historians still argue how widespread this practice was, and whether it was viewed as an acceptable shortcut or a last resort. You see funerary masks and painted coffins that are less ornate but still colorful and meaningful, showing the deceased with hopeful, serene faces ready for their next journey. Even without gold and jewels, these items held powerful magic and spiritual significance. The social aspect is striking. Neighbors, friends, and family often contributed to funerals, underscoring how death was a communal event. You get a sense that, regardless of wealth, everyone shared a deep hope for immortality and respect for tradition. Through this lens, you realize mummification wasn't just about individual legacy, but about belonging to a family, a community, and a civilization that treasured memory as much as life itself. The story of the common Egyptian's death is just as rich, reminding you that beneath all the grandeur, the human need to be remembered is universal and timeless. You find yourself drawn into the darker, more mysterious side of mummification, where rumors and legends mingle with the facts. Tales of curses, restless spirits, and supernatural vengeance have haunted mummies for centuries, stories so enduring that they shaped how the world imagines ancient Egypt's dead. You almost expect the mummy's bandages to twitch or a ghostly voice to whisper warnings in the shadows. The most famous mummy curse legend springs from their discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922. Shortly after, several people associated with the excavation died under strange circumstances, fueling sensational stories of a vengeful curse. You might chuckle at the notion of a supernatural revenge squad, but the idea stuck, growing into a cultural mythos that still fascinates horror fans and historians alike. Interestingly, some real curses were inscribed inside tombs, intended to ward off grave robbers and protect the deceased's peace. These inscriptions could be frighteningly direct, promising death or misfortune to anyone who dared disturb the sacred rest. But were they really effective, or just ancient warnings dressed up in dramatic language? Historians still debate if these curses were taken seriously or mostly served as psychological deterrents. On a stranger note, you learn about mummy medicine, where powdered mummy remains were ground into potions and remedies during the Middle Ages, a bizarre and grim practice that reveals how mummies' meaning shifted over time. This peculiar use of mummies as medicine, known as mumia, shows a whole new level of cultural recycling and superstition. You can't help but marvel at how the image of the mummy evolved from revered symbol of immortality to creepy icon of horror, and sometimes a misunderstood relic caught between myth and reality. This transformation tells you as much about modern fears and fascinations as it does about ancient beliefs. As you reflect, it becomes clear that mummies are not just about death or preservation. They are vessels of stories, fears, hopes, and imagination that stretch far beyond their time. They challenge us to look beyond the wrappings to the living beliefs and myths that continue to wrap around them even today. You find yourself drawn into the darker, more mysterious side of mummification, where rumors and legends mingle with the facts. Tales of curses, restless spirits, and supernatural vengeance have haunted mummies for centuries, stories so enduring that they shaped how the world imagines ancient Egypt's dead. You almost expect the mummy's bandages to twitch or a ghostly voice to whisper warnings in the shadows. The most famous mummy curse legend springs from their discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922. Shortly after, several people associated with the excavation died under strange circumstances, fueling sensational stories of a vengeful curse. You might chuckle at the notion of a supernatural revenge squad, but the idea stuck, growing into a cultural mythos that still fascinates horror fans and historians alike. Interestingly, some real curses were inscribed inside tombs, intended to ward off grave robbers and protect the deceased's peace. These inscriptions could be frighteningly direct, promising death or misfortune to anyone who dared disturb the sacred rest. But were they really effective, or just ancient warnings dressed up in dramatic language? Historians still debate if these curses were taken seriously or mostly served as psychological deterrents. On a stranger note, you learn about mummy medicine, where powdered mummy remains were ground into potions and remedies during the Middle Ages, a bizarre and grim practice that reveals how mummies' meaning shifted over time. This peculiar use of mummies as medicine, known as mumia, shows a whole new level of cultural recycling and superstition. You can't help but marvel at how the image of the mummy evolved from revered symbol of immortality to creepy icon of horror, and sometimes a misunderstood relic caught between myth and reality. This transformation tells you as much about modern fears and fascinations as it does about ancient beliefs. As you reflect, it becomes clear that mummies are not just about death or preservation. They are vessels of stories, fears, hopes, and imagination that stretch far beyond their time. They challenge us to look beyond the wrappings to the living beliefs and myths that continue to wrap around them even today. You're now drifting toward the mysteries wrapped beneath the linen, the spiritual beliefs and magical practices that guided mummification and the journey to the afterlife. For the ancient Egyptians, mummification wasn't just preservation. It was a sacred ritual infused with prayers, spells, and symbols meant to protect and empower the soul. It's like the ultimate insurance policy, but with a mystical twist. Right from the start, you realize that the body and the soul were deeply connected. The Egyptians believed the soul had several parts there, Ka, Ba, and Ak, each needing to be cared for separately to ensure the deceased's survival in the next world. The Ka, sort of like your life force, stayed near the body, requiring offerings of food and drink. The Ba, more like personality, could travel but needed to return to the mummy. The Ak was the transformed spirit capable of living eternally. To keep these spiritual parts happy and connected, embalmers recited spells from the Book of the Dead, the ancient guidebook for navigating the afterlife. These magical texts help the soul pass judgment, defeat demons, and find its way through perilous landscapes. You might smile at the idea of ancient Egyptians having their own supernatural GPS. A quirky fact: amulets, tiny charms shaped like scarabs, eyes, or gods, were wrapped into the linen layers. Each amulet had a specific magical purpose, like protecting the heart or ensuring safe passage through the underworld. You may not survive the ancient journey without your scarab-shaped lucky charm. Historians still argue about how strictly these spells and rituals were followed by embalmers and families. Some think the Book of the Dead was a luxury for the wealthy, while others argue the spells were widely known and adapted by common folk. Regardless, the blend of magic and religion, shows a culture obsessed with controlling fate beyond death. This spiritual dimension adds a layer of tenderness and fear. To the mummification story, people were not just embalming bodies, but nurturing souls trying to outwit the unknown. It's a reminder that beneath the science and art, the heart of mummification beats with hope, belief, and a bit of ancient magic. You can almost hear those whispered prayers echoing through time, offering comfort against the darkness and promises of eternal life. Wrapped in linen and faith, you find yourself standing at the crossroads where the ancient world meets modern imagination, a place where the mummy has become a figure of movies, books, and pop culture. The timeless allure of mummies has transformed them from sacred relics into icons of mystery, horror, and even humor, shaping how the world sees ancient Egypt today. The story of the mummy's curse you met earlier is just the tip of the iceberg. Hollywood took that creepy concept and ran with it, creating a whole genre filled with wrapped undead stalking pyramids, chasing adventurers, and unleashing supernatural havoc. From the classic 1932 film The Mummy starring Boris Karloff to more recent action-packed blockbusters, these portrayals often bear little resemblance to the respectful, spiritual practices of the Egyptians but capture imaginations worldwide. You might chuckle at how many times a bandage flaps or falls off in these movies, completely ruining the terrifying effect. It's almost as if the mummies are just trying to stay tidy. These stories mix fact and fiction in entertaining ways, but sometimes spread misconceptions that historians are still working to correct. A quirky detail: the rise of Egyptomania in the 19th and 20th centuries, sparked by archaeological discoveries, also influenced fashion, jewelry, and even architecture. Suddenly, Egyptian motifs adorned everything, from lampshades to wedding dresses, showing how deeply the fascination with mummies and ancient Egypt penetrated modern culture. Historians still debate the balance between respecting ancient traditions and embracing the playful myths that make mummies so enduring. This duality keeps the mystery alive. Mummies are simultaneously archaeological treasures and pop culture legends. As you look at a museum display beside a movie poster, you realize that mummies bridge worlds, the ancient and the modern, the sacred and the spooky. Their bandages wrap not just bodies, but layers of meaning, imagination, and enduring fascination. So whether you see a mummy as a guardian of eternity or a star of horror films, one thing's clear: these ancient preserved souls have never stopped telling stories, captivating hearts, and keeping the past alive. In the most unexpected ways, you find yourself gently sinking into the quiet twilight of Egypt's endless sands, where the story of mummification comes full circle, note, with loud declarations, but with a soft, lingering echo of eternity. After wandering through time, rituals, legends, and science, you begin to feel the weight and wonder of a civilization that faced death not with despair, but with meticulous hope and profound belief. The linen wraps have faded, the canopic jars have cracked, but the desire to preserve life beyond life remains vivid, a testament to human nature's refusal to accept finality. Every mummy you've met, royal or common, human or sacred animal, carried a story of love, fear, faith, and memory, each stitch in the linen a silent prayer. You've traveled with embalmers whose hands balanced sacred rites and scientific skill, with families who crafted funerary art with painstaking care, and with spirits believed to journey through dark realms. This was a culture that saw death not as an end but as a transformation, a passage into a world as real and complex as the one left behind. Historians still puzzle over details, debates about methods, and meanings swirl like desert winds. But the core remains clear. The Egyptians' quest was universal, to be remembered, to continue, to hold on to. Identity beyond the silence. And now, as the night deepens around you, imagine that soft desert breeze carrying whispers of ancient prayers, rustling the sands over forgotten tombs. These echoes invite you to rest, to let go, and perhaps to dream of faraway times when the boundaries between life and death were held by fragile linen threads and sacred words. So breathe in that cool night air, feel the calm that has settled over millennia, and let the story of mummification lull you gently toward your own peaceful sleep. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together.